class is about trying to understand how we conceptualize Europeanization, what it means, and it's part of this larger focus of this class, but also of the Jean Monnet chair I'm holding, as well as of larger fields of excellence at the university and research kind of scope of the center. So what I want to do today is, first of all, try to understand what is Europeanization, how is it understood, and then going towards an idea of kind of broadening this concept, having a wider understanding of it and how it can be applied for understanding these processes in Southeastern Europe. Because in fact, the idea of Europeanization has its origins not at all in the study of Southeastern Europe, but well beyond that. And in fact, originally it was more focused within the European Union. And we'll kind of come up with the end with maybe a way we can think about critical Europeanization and kind of understand it slightly differently. So the term has been around for 3 or 4 decades and has had many different definitions. So there isn't one way of thinking about Europeanization. You will find different understandings in the literature about what it means. It's also, of course, a very vague term because it's kind of course, if you go to the core of it, all it means is that it's about making something European. But, you know, what is Europe? I mean, as long as that answer isn't easily, can be no easy answer given to that, already that term Europeanization is problematic because, of course, this is maybe kind of an important caveat, is that while it's used as Europeanization, historically the term in the last decades has been primarily described as something which applies to the European Union. And there you can already see a challenge there because, you know, it goes without saying that Europe is much broader than the European Union in terms of the territories it entails, but also the historical background. Europe has a terminology being used for centuries, while the European Union is, of course, a political project which is relatively recent. And, you know, even if you could go back, then even if you include the European Community and the European Economic Community, it still is a project which began, you know, after World War II, and Europe, of course, as a term precedes that. So Europeanization has already this difficulty built in. And then if you take the kind of perspective of human geographers who kind of also question the concept of Europe. I mean, conventionally people say, well, Europe is a continent and it's defined, by its borders being on the east and the Urals and the Bosporus and in the Mediterranean in the south. But even that is a tricky question because what is, it's an agreement. I mean, what Europe was changed over the centuries, and Europe initially actually described the part of the Balkans, what we call the Balkans today. I mean, parts of ancient Greece where the term Europe was first used. So Europe is even not a fixed terminology and not even a geographically well-defined one, because the borders between Europe and Asia, at least, are certainly a matter of human definition, not of objective fact. It's not a matter of kind of real geography in the sense of some kind of real territory, but this is what humans agree, that that's where the borders of Europe and Asia are. And so we can't take them as fixed or given, but have to agree that they are human constructs and agreements. So the term originally was used to describe processes in the European Union. So, here's an early definition from 1994, which talks about the incremental process of reorienting the direction and shape of politics to the degree that the European community at the time's political and economic dynamics become part of the organizational logic of national politics and policy making. So that definition by Ladrich, basically all it says is that it tried to understand that rather than the European Union being this kind of superstructure, which is in addition or an additional layer on top of the member states, it transforms the member states. So it becomes part of the decision-making, policy-making, and as he says, the organizational logic of the European Union itself. So what this means is that the European Union is not just the institutions you think about when you hear European Union, the Parliament, the Commission, the Court of Justice, the Court of Auditors, and the other institutions, but it is in fact permeating the institutions below it. And this is, I think, the first insight which Europeanization in its approach offered, because it said, well, we shouldn't study Europe, or in fact European Union, just as the institutions which are at the top, but rather look downwards and see how the national and also subnational institutions have been transformed by the European Union. But of course, that has still nothing to do with the countries which are not in the European Union. And so that was in a certain way just the first step of introducing this term in the debates. And it's been expanding, as I would say, outwards and within in terms of what it entails. So here's a kind of how it evolved over time, and you know, by the mid-2000s, so 15 years ago, it talked about these a number of kind of key concepts. So understanding Europeanization in this definition talks about the construction, diffusion, and institutionalization of rules, procedures, policy paradigm styles, the way of doing things. So you know, it includes issues of norms, beliefs. So it's no longer just about the kind of mechanical implementation of EU rules at the national or subnational level. This is how it originally began. So, you know, most EU rules are not EU laws in the conventional sense, but they are implemented through national legislation and subnational acts. And so, in that sense, you know, you notice it now when the UK has left the EU that, of course, most EU rules are still in place because the European Union's legislation has been implemented through national British rules. So even if you take away the EU is still within Britain very much, and it will take probably decades if the UK decides so to purge, quote unquote, or to eliminate EU law from its national legislation, because they've been many of the laws which have been passed in the last 4 decades in Britain are EU laws or based on EU decisions. So this was the first understanding, but that is, of course, just the first part. And then it's also about the idea of the way of doing things, which means about not just the laws, but also the processes which surround them. Because, you know, the European Union has a certain number of ways of doing things. For example, it's a consensus-seeking institution. Even if there are majority decisions, the EU has traditionally been very much focused on trying to get maximum support from its member states. So already there you can see that that's a particular way of doing things, which is quite different from, let's say, classical majoritarianism, where a majority, no matter how narrow, is seen as legitimate to impose laws or to decide on laws. Like this is the British, you know, system of a majoritarian democracy. So in that sense, it's not just about rules, but it's also about how these rules are understood. And the European Union is not just a consensus-seeking institution, but also one which has always identified itself as a normative actor. Now that's become very much under criticism, especially in external policy, you know, in regard to how much does it protect or defend human rights or democracy externally, and you know, even within there's been criticism of its inability to fully reinforce these rules and norms internally. You know, think about Hungary or Poland, but the kind of normative assumptions of the EU have been always very strong, and it's, you know, the raison d'être. It's in a story it tells about itself as one which is very normatively kind of has a strong normative underpinning, namely the idea of being a peace project and preventing the reoccurrence of war by integrating the countries. All of these are kind of very strong normative understandings. So what this kind of understanding of Europeanization implies is that it's not just about the hardware of the European Union, but it's also about the software. It's also about the way in which the EU understands itself, and also then by doing so transforms the actors who are doing Europe, who are in a certain way participating in these institutions. Now, this of course is still primarily focused on the EU itself, and also on the way, not just the institutions, but also the citizens, how citizens, you know, for example, partake and talk about European institutions. And of course, there's a lot of discussion, has been over the last decades, to which degree there is, for example, a European public space. You know, this always comes up in discussions about European parliaments, and became even more acute when there was the idea of Spitzenkandidaten, to have, kind of candidates for the different political parties in Europe, which would run transnationally, and which would gather support transnationally, even if they were still elected in a particular member state setting. But there you can see that there was a broadening of this understanding of Europeanization, but still not in a certain way to cover our part, or at least not entirely, Southeastern Europe. Now, then we can look at another way. Olson in 2002 tried to conceptualize the different ways of Europeanization, how to understand it. And now he was arguing that there are kind of 5 dimensions to look at. One is the kind of changes to the external boundaries of the European Union, which is enlarging, basically. So the EU is, in that sense, promoting the idea of Europeanization outside of its own boundaries. The second one is the idea of the integration at the supranational level, so the way in which institutions function in the EU itself. The third is the penetration of the European Union project's norms, rules, downwards. So that's kind of the conventional, this is how Europeanization started out with. So to kind of the idea of how does EU rules become, and norms and behaviors become part of national and subnational decision making. Then the fourth is the diffusion of the model of European integration, so the exporting it. And that's not about enlargement per se, but it's about the kind of larger way in which the EU is, become a global, actor, not as a kind of direct actor, but often the diffusion means that this comes up, for example, now in the context of the British departure from the European Union, that now Britain could design its own rules on emissions, for example, or on standards for certain products. But there's a strong incentive not to do so in Britain. Why? Because the EU standards, as a major important kind of trading unit block in the world, is often a standard setter. So if a car maker or a truck maker would decide on different environmental standards in Britain, they probably couldn't sell those trucks in the EU, and in fact in very few other places, because often these EU standards become global standards because of its weight as an actor. So it's the kind of diffusion, not just of these rules, but of other rules in the international sphere. And then, of course, the fifth one is the kind of idea of political unification, the normative concept of the European Union, which is underpinning it. So you can see here, this is, you could say also, these are different ways of conceptualizing European integration. But this is very much how he conceptualized Europeanization. So you can see here that this is, much broader already than just kind of the narrow downloading of particular laws and rules. Now, there are a couple of limitations when we're looking at this concept. And this is where some of the critiques are coming in. The first one is that, are we actually talking about Europeanization or EUization? Because, a lot of that, what we're talking about, is actually how the European Union as an actor is transforming itself and other its member states, as well as the international system and other countries. But is this really Europeanization? Because how do we deal with the fact that there are plenty of countries which are not in the European Union, but which are in Europe? And also, what happened? Was there no Europeanization before the 1950s, the Rome treaties, or the establishment of the European coal and steel community? Probably that, you could say there was no EUization or European integration in the sense of this particular project, but there were attempts of European integration well before 1950s, and there was, of course, certainly many of these dynamics which we talk about, the transfer of ideas, the transfer of norms, of laws. All of this is not something which began with the European Union. So in that sense, if we're just limiting ourselves to the European Union, there's a risk that we're kind of perpetuating the idea that the EU is a very special case which has no historical precedent and is unique as such. And that is, always for scholarship problematic if you kind of create the sense of a particular phenomena you're studying, like the European Union, being unique and uncomparable. So that's one of the problems. So we could just define it as EUization and say there's a special set of transfers of ideas and rules, but then we're really not helping to kind of understand how this fits into larger historical processes, and also what is going on beyond the European Union. Because even today, you could say there are certain spaces of communication and European spheres, whether it's soccer world, a European Cup, or Eurovision Song Contest, or other institutions which have nothing to do with the European Union, but which are creating some kind of shared spaces of shared expectations, and we would exclude them. So we have to kind of broaden our understanding. The second problem is that there is a kind of normative underpinning. I mean, it's not explicitly said, but there is a kind of an assumption that Europeanization is a good thing. If you're a supporter of EU integration, it has a kind of inherently positive connotation. And it also has a risk of suggesting that there is an inherent, kind of benefit of Europeanizing, that this is in a certain way a positive transformative process. And I'm speaking here as somebody who is not just holding a Jean Monnet chair on this topic, so in that sense I could say the chair is funded by the European Union, so shouldn't I be grateful for that? But of course, we can reflect on it critically and reflect that it assumes a certain normative kind of positive normative angle, which even if you're pro-European and support European integration, you have to look at critically, because not every single decision of the European Union inherently is a good one, right? So it's not just because you support the political project doesn't mean every particular aspect of it is necessarily desirable. And if we're taking a more historical kind of approach to all of this, then we can also say, well, in fact, aren't there historical episodes of quote-unquote Europeanization which are highly problematic? Global colonialism is a European project. The world was colonized by European powers. Now, we might decide not to call it Europeanization, but we can certainly say that there were global processes in the last half a millennia which had their origins in Europe and which had very problematic normative dimensions, like colonization or slavery. And so in that sense, if we're taking Europeanization more broadly, we have to also be more critical of the normative underpinning. The third kind of limitation or issue which we have to grapple with is the directionality. Europeanization, in the way it's kind of conceptualized, at least originally, very much was one where you're looking from Brussels towards everywhere else, or from the center to a periphery. And again, originally within Europe, and the periphery could be in Belgium itself or in other member states. But as you expand it, there's a risk that it has this directionality of looking at a center where these ideas and norms are made, and a place where those are applied. And then sometimes even the terminology used has been called like kind of downloading. So it's countries which are downloading the laws and the rules. But of course, that's a very short-sighted or kind of partial view, because there's also uploading. I mean, the laws and rules of the European Union themselves are, of course, made and co-made by member states, and by not just member states as single actors, but as quite heterogeneous actors. So that means that Malta and Estonia and Cyprus and Ireland partake in those rules and decision making. It's not Brussels as a kind of anonymous actor as it's often portrayed, especially in media discourses. So the directionality is both ways. And of course, even when we're talking about countries or societies which are not members of the European Union, are in these processes engaged and are not just in a certain way recipients of these processes. And again, if we're looking at a larger historical background, it's like, where is Europeanization created? And it's certainly not just created in Brussels. It might have been created in Vienna in the Habsburg times, or in London or Paris or Berlin or Moscow. I mean, they're not there's not a single actor and there's not a single direction in which these processes are going. Then, of course, there are blind spots, and this is the fourth kind of limitation. Blind spots might be particular topics which are neglected, which are, kind of because they don't fit into the framework of the European Union. They are culture, fashion, and all kinds of other aspects which might not seem to fit into the kind of conventional understanding of Europeanization, but which, when you actually look at the way in which these ideas are transferred and negotiated, should be included, and especially if we're taking a longer historical perspective. And then finally, a limitation is that there's a certain kind of, nearly teleological assumption that this is a process which is kind of proceeding and going on, and it's kind of, even the term Europeanization suggests in a certain way directionality in terms of getting towards more Europeanization. But of course, you can have de-Europeanization. You can have Europeanization break down or fail, and you could even have, competing Europeanizations. Maybe we should use the term in the plural. There have been observers who've been noticing, and I've also argued this, how, for example, far-right populist political parties in Europe, like Viktor Orban's Fidesz, for example, and others, are no longer anti-European in the conventional way, but they're rather rejecting the current integration process in many ways, criticizing it, but they're trying to, in a certain way, capture what is understood by Europe. They're trying to promote a different type of Europe, one which is more conservative, more nationalist, but their arguments are not about just Hungary or about single nation states, but rather about a different Europe, which is based stronger on nation states. And we have this rhetoric from Marine Le Pen in France to Orban and others, and so they are no longer advocating Frexit and other departures from the European Union, but rather they want to reclaim Europe for their own right. So this is a different understanding of Europeanization, one which we might have normative problems with, but one which is claiming to be European just in a different way than it's conventionally understood. So these are all kinds of limitations we have to deal with when we're dealing with Europeanization. So when we're now talking about Southeastern Europe as a region, of course, the key point is there that we're talking about Europeanization. Not only, of course, some of the countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Greece longer have been members of the European Union for decades, or at least one decade. There are others which are countries where Europeanization is this process which affects them as future or potential member states. And these processes can last for a very long period of time. If we think of Turkey, which has been aspiring to EU membership for several decades, and one where also there's a larger historical process of quote-unquote Europeanization, if you think back about the reforms of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk beginning in the 1920s. So there you can see these processes of being outside of the European Union and Europeanization taken maybe a more historical perspective. So if we're taking a broader view of Europeanization, not just being about EU integration, and looking at Southeastern Europe, there is this kind of larger, historical dimension of global Europeanization, which I've already alluded to, which is not particular to Southeastern Europe, but which is this wider historical phenomena of, which has been often called, Westernization, or has been given other terms, but it's essentially the dominance of overwhelmingly West European countries or actors in the global sphere, through trade, through discovery, or through slavery and colonization, which meant that the global economic and political system beginning in the late Middle Ages and early modern time was shaped by, basically West European powers, be they, Spain and Portugal, or Venice and Genoa, or before that, and then later on, the lowlands and Britain. And that, of course, is one which also affected Southeastern Europe economically and politically, especially in the long conflicts between European powers and the Ottoman Empire. And then we have the emerging nation states of Southeastern Europe in the 19th century, which often sought to find clients, supporters among the great powers in Europe to achieve their goals, and then once they were established, often sought to emulate them. So we find that countries of Southeastern Europe, after their independence, often copied laws. Belgian constitution, Swiss laws were popular. And you could even say rulers, as German princes were exported from Germany, where they were in great oversupply to the countries, newly independent countries, where the kings of Greece and Romania and Bulgaria and also shortly Albania were furnished by German princes or Austrian, Hungarian princes. So you can see there that there's in a certain way, an emulation, but also a transfer of personnel and ideas coming from let's say, Central and West European countries, well preceding the European Union. And the questions there were always those between autonomy and dependency. On one side, if you look at many of the countries of Southeastern Europe throughout the 19th and 20th century, at least until the socialist period, were strongly dependent economically, for example, on French, British, Austrian, German banks, which invested and dominated the credit markets in Southeastern Europe, in which states had huge debts often and defaulted on them occasionally. And so there was a sense of dependency, very much, also political dependency, and the question of how much autonomy is possible within that. So Europeanization there didn't mean equality, but it rather meant often dependencies from more influential European countries in the West. So you can see if we're applying Europeanization outside of the EU to Southeastern Europe, we have a much broader historical experience. So if we go to the kind of historical episodes, one of the kind of key questions was, is how to deal with Europe as a model, and we have, I have here chosen two pictures from an archive which is in the University of Graz as part of kind of visual anthropology of old photography from Southeastern Europe, and there's a picture kind of depicting the kind of two choices or dilemmas or often self-perceptions. One of the Balkans as a place which is more traditional and often has clothing and dress codes which are not characteristic for other parts of Europe, and then others which are kind of very explicitly trying to break with tradition. And for example, they are seeing in Istanbul in the 1920s with women drinking beer, and in a certain way thus breaking with tradition, both in fashion but also in alcohol consumption. And these questions of where are these kind of indigenous processes, or are these copies? And there was even during the Ottoman period, the kind of term alla franga, which meant something like Frankish style, which is an old-fashioned way of describing kind of Westerners, and which often had a negative undercurrent because it suggested it was a copy. It wasn't the kind of authentic own idea, but rather one which was emulating fashions from elsewhere without kind of fully appropriating them and in a certain way endorsing them. And of course, that's not how it was, but this understanding that if the influences, if the ideas and the impetus also for transformation come from the outside, then it's very easy to often dismiss them as imports and not as quote-unquote authentic. And this kind of debate has been one which has been very important in Southeastern Europe, often where impetus for transformation often were driven by external actors or external ideas, and of course they were transformed and converted domestically, but the perception that they originated from the outside often undermined their credibility. And we have, of course, the other side, which is the term Balkanization as a negative term. So Europeanization is seen as kind of the positive term of countries cooperating and transforming themselves. The term used as a counter term to that is Balkanization. And again, I'm not saying it as a term which I would promote, but one which has become commonly used. And if you see it, read newspapers, you find articles about the Balkanization of Syria, the Balkanization of America, the Balkanization of the internet. So these terms, the term Balkanization has become very much detached from the Balkans itself, but it just describes nothing else but the fragmentation of a unit into smaller pieces. And of course, Europeanization could be understood as the opposite of the kind of the merging together of different units into a larger whole. So it's a kind of the counter term. And this term of Balkanization is very much associated with a negative understanding of the Balkans as a powder keg, as you can see in a movie poster from during World War II, or the British satirical magazine Punch, which talked about the Balkan Troubles, which was kind of both a counter model to European integration as well as a threat to Europe, as well as the kind of narratives over the last 100 or 150 years. And of course, this is one one has to look at very problematically, because in fact, the Balkan Troubles are not ones which were where the great powers, as depicted in the cartoon by Punch, were innocent victims of, but rather they themselves were kind of actively encouraging the troubles, quote unquote, for their own advantage. So in that sense, the metaphor, of course, of the powder keg is one which one should dismiss, but one which is very powerful and potent and remains influential in the discussions about Europeanization and its countermodels. So, you have, in fact, what some people have called self-Balkanization, that because the kind of label of you're not European, but you're Balkan, or Balkanization as a counter term to Europeanization, has often meant that there's a kind of idea that Balkans is this negative side to Europe. And Maria Todorova, in her book Imagining the Balkans, has written extensively about Balkanism, or the idea of the Balkans as a kind of a negative mirror of Europe in many ways. Similar but different from Orientalism, which Edward Said has written about. And some of the responses has been to kind of either to kind of absorb and internalize the idea of Balkanization. And that can work in two different ways. I mean, one is to Balkanize others, so to, in a certain way, extract yourself from the Balkans by describing others as more Balkan. And Milica Bakić-Hajdn has done that in the 1990s in her article. I mean, she hasn't done it, but she's described it in her article about nesting Orientalism, where she says, there's a phenomena in the Yugoslav context where each nation often describes its southern and eastern neighbor as more Balkan and more Oriental than they themselves are, to prove how European they are. So you can already see there that by kind of self-Europeanizing yourself, maybe you're describing yourself as European, you might also then, in a certain way, dismiss others to prove your Europeanness as being more Balkan or more Oriental and more, quote-unquote, backwards. And, we have this in the way in which discourse about Albanians in Serbia, discourse about Serbs in Croatia, and so on. So everybody else is more Balkan and more Oriental and more un-European than they are. And then, of course, there's a different way of self-Balkanization, which is actually genuine self-Balkanization, which is kind of explicitly saying, well, in fact, yes, we're not European. We are Balkan as a kind of rebellion, appropriation of the negative stereotypes, but one which often exactly does that. It appropriates, but it also accepts those stereotypes. So if you, for example, ever watched the movie Underground by the Bosnian filmmaker Emir Kusturica, which was made in the mid-1990s, he very much kind of talks about the Yugoslav wars as a kind of reoccurring violence, and you get a sense if you watch the movie that violence, just like excessive emotions, are a natural state of affairs in the Balkans, and that's what sets them apart from the kind of rational Europeans. So it's this kind of rejection of the notion of becoming European, but rather saying we like the Balkan way of doing things, which is more emotional, more passionate. Yes, it has more violence, but that's just the way it is. And that kind of accepts all of the stereotypes, but kind of turns them around, saying, yes, so what's wrong with that? So in that sense, there's in a certain way, that's kind of a counter reaction to Europeanization, or the claim that there's a negative Balkan stereotypes, and that they form kind of the counterpart to Europe or Europeanization. And we'll see why this is problematic from many points of view. Because you could say that, is Balkanization and Europeanization, are they really contradictory or conflicting processes? Igor Sticks, a writer, has recently published a piece where he was arguing that, in fact, instead of Europeanizing the Balkans, the EU is becoming Balkanized. I mean, he was writing this under the impression of Brexit and the rise of populist parties, and kind of arguing that, well, isn't it ironic that the EU talks about making the Balkans European, but what is happening is that the EU is becoming more Balkan, and he kind of follows up on a nice episode of a famous Bosnian satirical group, which are called the Surrealists, and had a show in the early 90s and late 80s, right before the war, in Bosnia, called Top Lista Nadrealista. And they had one skit where you can see a screenshot from it here, where the EU observer watches the Yugoslav wars across a wall. You can see it depicted there, and then he welcomes the last survivor of the Yugoslav wars to the European Union, who are celebrating their union. But while he's being fed in a lavish dinner, the EU countries are fighting over who is to blame for the Yugoslav wars, and they get escalating into a shouting match, which then means that the war now threatens no longer Yugoslavia, but the EU, and the last survivor of the Balkan wars climbs across the fence and across the wall to hide from the Europeans fighting now. So, I mean, the skit is basically saying nothing else, that the war in Yugoslavia could also be a European war. And, the kind of the way in which these dynamics work are not necessarily Balkan, but they're part of could be also European. And what it kind of suggests, and I think that's an important observation, is that the idea of Balkanization, or the underlying assumption, is the creation of homogeneous nation states. If you think about the wars of the 1990s or earlier processes, and these are deeply European processes. The idea of nation states and the idea of homogeneous nation states are not non-European ideas. They are deeply European processes. And so in that sense, what is often called Balkanization is, in fact, you could turn around the terminology and call it Europeanization, because it is really what has happened, that countries in Southeastern Europe try to emulate, of course, a very perverted and certainly not very desirable, but a widely accepted idea that state and nation should be congruent, and that creating nation states is a natural process in which countries should develop towards. And so in that sense, you can kind of raise the question and say, is Balkanization really the opposite of Europeanization, or is in fact Balkanization nothing else but a type of Europeanization, i.e. emulating European models of rule and governing, ones which are, of course, highly problematic in the way they were done. You also have this process of what I call self-Europeanization, and this is, I can give you an example. Just a few days ago, the government of North Macedonia kind of made a commitment that it would kind of self-Europeanize in the absence of being able to join the European Union in the foreseeable future. It's blocked by a veto by Bulgaria to start accession talks. It basically committed itself to trying to conduct the reforms required to join the European Union independently of joining the European Union, because the argument is the laws, the rules of the EU are all desirable for a country to function, and as a result, adopting them kind of unilaterally or adopting them through one's own internal processes is desirable, irrespective of whether it entails EU membership. And there's a strong argument to be made for that, but it's kind of could be described as metaphorically kind of self-Europeanizing, and Europe can be both kind of a goal, and it's often framed as such, so that you can see here, for example, from two election campaigns, one in Bosnia and one in Serbia, where Europe becomes a strong metaphor in the campaign. So one party was campaigning with with on the right way 100% Europe, right? So saying the party is 100% European, or down at the bottom left, a poster from the 2012 Serbian elections where it says, the European step is good for everybody. So again, here, Europe becomes a kind of basically a cipher or a shortcut for all kinds of things which are communicated with there, right? So you can think about, what does a party mean when it says 100% Europe, or a European step is good for everybody? That's, it uses the symbols, of course, the European flag, but it implies, it's a lot of kind of implicit in the package in these messages. So it's suggesting that modern, prosperous, recognized, so there are all kinds of assumptions which are underpinning this term of kind of describing yourself as European. In fact, in Serbia for many years, there still is an award given out by some NGO to people being called most European, the most European of the year. And in recent years, this award has been given to people whose record is much more dubious in that claim. But of course, already the idea that somebody could be the most European is already a very kind of interesting idea, because what does it mean not to be European? Who is the least European? So it kind of shows you how this term Europeanization and being European has become kind of a metaphor for all kinds of meanings which are often implicit. Because if you maybe then kind of try to ask people, what does it mean to be European? What does a Bosnian party in Sarajevo mean to be European, or a Serbian party in Belgrade? Do they actually mean the same thing? In many ways they might, but in many ways they might actually diverge. But Europe is also an abstract bracket, which can be both good as well as also bad, because if you actually have to then spell out the content of being European, you might actually discover that there is a lot less consensus, and there's arguments in the literature about the benefits of not fully elaborated agreements, not fully kind of spelled out agreements, but it also has certain problems with it. So there's, in that sense, I mean, Europeanization, what is this self-Europeanization, Europeanization understood? And, they're often, conflicting and different understandings of it. And, one, you could, take a critical understanding and saying, well, isn't Europeanization nothing else but a new mission civilisatrice? Mission civilisatrice is the term used in France during the colonial experience, which, of course, not in that term, but in that understanding, was also deeply part of the British colonial and the other European colonial understandings, that the dominance of Europe globally was one about spreading values and imposing those values on backward countries. If you're ever a fan of Tintin or the Belgian cartoon, there's a rather racist one, early one about him in the Congo, when Congo was still a Belgian colony, and Tintin is teaching African children about their fatherland, Belgium, and so he's teaching them in a certain way how to become good Europeans or good Belgians. And the civilizing mission, of course, is one which has been deeply criticized for all the obvious reasons for its kind of colonial underpinnings and for justifying colonial rule. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the EU is engaged in colonialism, although, of course, some authors have made the argument. But one has to be kind of careful that isn't there kind of a civilizational mission underpinning the European project, especially when it takes place outside of the borders of the European Union. And one should at least be critical about that and kind of wonder, is this kind of this imposition of external values and norms not one has to be also critical of? Then, of course, others can understand the Europeanization as just a technical process, one where it says, okay, it's about countries joining the European Union, the processes, the mechanisms of going through this, and this is how the institutions often understand it. And then there's the normative one, which is what I was describing with this idea of self-Europeanization, often that is also used as a tool by elites and societal actors in countries of the Western Balkans, for example, to make their case in favor of transformation. So they, if you're advocating for LGBT rights, then that's one way to say this is European. It's a European idea, so you can communicate certain values or issues as European and then get legitimacy for them in a way which you wouldn't get otherwise. So the argument, it's easier to argue that minority rights or rights of sexual minorities is European and thus should be acceptable than making another argument for them. So Europe helps to make arguments in domestic debates, sometimes legitimate ones and sometimes also problematic ones. And we'll talk about this in the course of this class, for example, when Anna Milosevic in one of the last units will talk about the memory cultures and how commemoralization, in fact, and the idea of Europe can help to justify also very illiberal practices, if we're looking at that. By the way, on the left you can see a monument in Sarajevo about, which was to the a kind of ironic monument, because this was this is a canned beef, which is EU food aid provided to the besieged citizens of Sarajevo during the war, and it's called a monument to the international community. And of course, it's meant ironically, considering that the assistance given was not to prevent the war happening or 100,000 people dying, but rather just to give food aid. So, of course, there's not, it's not that this idea of Europeanization is without alternatives or without resistance. So there is opposition to that, and it can take multiple forms. It can take the forms of alternatives in terms of regional unification. So no, there's not just Europeanization, there's also Balkan unification, whether this historical ideas of Balkan federalism, which often saw itself to be a counterweight to the dominance by great powers, or in the end Yugoslavia, as especially the socialist Yugoslavia, which with the non-aligned movement and the attempt to not be part of either the West or the East in the Cold War, was very explicit about its idea of having an alternative path towards modernity, which is not shaped by emulating the West or emulating the Soviet model. And in that sense, there was a clear alternative which was explored. Of course, nation states can be an alternative, which of course is a contradictory one, because on one side, nation states as a model is a European model, but the way in which they're expressed might be then also one which is trying to oppose external influence. And then, of course, there can be allies in other non-European models. So we see, there's a lot of debate in recent years about the rising role of non-European powers in the Western Balkans, and most prominently in the last year, China here, embodied by a poster put up in Belgrade by the tabloid Informer, which thanked China for the assistance of provision of medical assistance during the early phases of the COVID crisis under the slogan, thank you, brother Xi, thanking the Chinese president explicitly for assistance. And again, they are kind of, China is given as a model, alternative, and this has been also rhetorically strong. There's another model of modernity and of transformation of goals, and that could be China rather than the European Union. So in that sense, Europeanization is in fact competing with other ideas as well. And then, this is what I was saying, the idea of nation states is, of course, the most prominent one, and it's kind of a contradictory one, because it's on one side, it's emulating Western nation states. And I mean, I find it best embodied in Skopje 2014, this project of urban transformation of Skopje, which was promoted by the previous government of North Macedonia, which sought to rebuild the city, but by doing so copied many pieces of architecture from other European cities or other examples. So, for example, red double-decker buses were introduced very much looking like the British double-decker buses in London, or a glass cupola was installed on top of the parliament, the Sobranje, which very much looked like a copy of the glass cupola on top of the German parliament in Berlin. So there are many other elements which kind of seemed like nearly like a pastiche of different European capitals in Skopje, but the project at the same time was deeply about rejecting, let's say, Greek claims about the name, and was very much a nation-building project, which was rejecting, in a certain way, Europeanization in terms of joining the European Union, but at the same time emulating European nation states, both physically as well as in terms of the kind of underlying model. And so in that sense, nation states are an interesting represent the duality of both signifying copying or emulating European nation-state models, but also then possibly rejecting Europeanization as it's often understood. So where does this take us all? And again, this class is more kind of introductory one to kind of give you some concepts and also how to think about Europeanization. So rather than saying, well, we should just give up Europeanization, looking at it from a lens of Southeastern Europe and trying to think about Southeastern Europe kind of upside down, as here represented by this map, it's that we should think about Europeanization as being multidimensional. So it's not just limited to EU integration and the institutions. It has a historical background, which if we ignore it, we forget also why Europeanization matters today in a particular way. It's much more complicated and than kind of just the simple EU process, and it kind of we need to rethink it by looking at kind of post-colonial studies, which do comment on these power relations, and also does beg questions about area studies. So to kind of we need to rethink Europeanization. We need to study it more broadly. And again, many of the lectures you will be hearing in the course of this class are exactly trying to do that, trying to both think more critically about Europeanization in the way in which the EU's transformation is happening or not happening, but also expanding more broadly and looking at other elements which one can study when one looks at Europeanization. So this is pretty much what I've been wanting to do today, which is about kind of just giving you some concepts which help you maybe understand or think about Europeanization more critically. And of course, it's a way to look at the developments, including thinking about why is EU integration of the Western Balkans not such an easy process and so long-lasting, and what are the challenges to it, but also how we can think about European integration and Europeanization more broadly, well beyond Southeastern Europe. So it's in a certain way trying to raise some broader questions.